Your resume is arguably the most important business document you'll ever write. So let's get started on how to make one. Today in this video, I'll talk about the format, the 4 key sections of your resume, and some other considerations that you should keep in mind as you're writing your resume. There are some general format, consistency, and quality things we want to keep in mind right off the bat. First things first, when we're submitting our resumes, it's not just being looked at by a human with a human eye. It's often looked through by a computer with some sort of artificial intelligence or AI or algorithm that's determining which resumes rise to the top of the pile and which resumes stay on the bottom. So therefore, we need our resume to appeal to those computer programs, which don't often care about formatting and really visually how it looks. But we also need to appeal to people who will review our resumes sometimes for 30 seconds or less and may not even look at the words on the page so much as just the general format and the vibe of the resume to get their first impression. So it needs to be visually appealing and also contain really solid content. Our resume is going to be what gets us an interview, so we want it to be clear, concise, and compelling. If you've never in your life seen a resume before, that's okay. Here are a couple of examples to just get you in the right frame of mind for when we're talking about resumes. On the left side, Derek Crabtree has a summary, some highlights, a few experiences, and education. On the right, Paul Mitchell's got a summary, some skills, a work history, and an education. There are things that I would improve about these documents, both of them, but they're both fine visualizations of a resume. The thing about resumes is that when we humans are told to read a document here in the United States, we read from the top of the page to the bottom of the page and from the left side of the page to the right side of the page. On David Nelson's resume, if I do just that, I start by seeing his professional summary of qualifications and professional skills right down there on the left-hand side, and then I find his contact information on the right. However, with Thomas Blumenthal's, we start by seeing his name, and then we get some personal information, we get some software, and we get some languages. Now, I would encourage you to not have a column on the left side of your resume. And that is because when a person looks at your resume, they're going to first probably be looking for where'd you go to school, where have you worked in the past, what positions have you held? And that stuff is a lot easier to find on a resume like David Nelson's, where it's aligned on the left side of the page, than a resume like Thomas's when it's on the right side of the page. Another thing to think about early when you're creating your resume is your font. We want to choose our font carefully. Some good fonts are listed on the right, things like Helvetica, Calibri, Garamond, Georgia, Tribucate, and Times New Roman. One thing I would encourage you to do is think about choosing a font that's not Times New Roman or not Calibri. And that's because those are the default fonts in things like Google Docs and Microsoft Word. If we're really trying to go and be above and beyond with our resume, we might want to include or to choose a font that shows we put some thought into the font that we chose. For example, Times New Roman is seen as clean, easy to read, but like sweatpants. Like we didn't put any effort, we just chose a font that was there. So picking a different font can be helpful in setting your document apart and showing that you put thought into it. However, we don't want to use fonts that look like typewriters or are a little too childish. Now that we've got some of those early things out of the way, let's talk about what goes on your page and what your page should really look like. We want our resume to be one page ideally. I know sometimes we have tons of really great experience and it feels really hard to cut it down, but one page is really kind of the expectation, so we want to hit that expectation when we can. Now, if you really truly have tons and tons and tons of highly relevant experiences, or you're going for an executive or higher level job, then yes, our resume can definitely be longer. But everyone in this class, let's really try to shoot for one page with our first drafts of the resume. I'm serious, one page. If we have really extensive experience, then we can go on to 2 pages, but we really don't want to have a mostly blank second page. Then it would seem, or even just a half a second page, then it would seem like, okay, we probably could have got it up to 1 page if we would have worked a little harder on it. So really try to shoot for 1 page, and please don't use the fill-in-the-blank resume templates or resume wizards. There are a couple of templates that I see every semester. I usually look through about 75 resumes, and there'll be 5 to 10 that are in one of the formats and 5 to 10 that are in the other formats. They're difficult because the sections are hard to adjust, and we really don't want our resume to look like everyone else's. Your resume is a kind of visual and textual representation of you on a piece of paper, and we don't want you to be like all the other applicants that are applying. We want to keep our font size to 10, 11, or 12. You can go higher for your headings and things, but we don't want to go lower than 10. Even 10 is kind of small sometimes, so make sure your font is a good legible size. And then we don't want our margins to be any skinnier around our page than 0.5. So your margins are the top of your page, the side of your page. We don't want that to be skinnier than 0.5 because we run the risk of it getting cut off. Our resume should be well organized and consistent. We want to use things like bold, italic, underline, font size, font type, italics, again, spaces and columns to break up the text and make our document easy to read. But when we're using those, we want to be consistent in the way that we're using them across sections. We also want to be consistent with our use of punctuation marks and spacing throughout our documents. So for example, at the end of your bullet points, either use a period or don't. It doesn't really matter, but be consistent. Or if you're going to use these dashes, always use a short dash or always use a long dash, but be consistent with the dashes that you choose. Same with like the number of spaces between different sections. We always want to have things be very consistent across our sections. And then we'd also be prudent to list our dates using the exact same format throughout. So you can either do month, comma, year, month, year, or you can do numerical with the numbers / year. If I were in your shoes, I would do the numbers / year approach because those computer softwares have an easier time reading our numbers than they do our words. Plus, sometimes we feel tempted to abbreviate things like February, March, April, but it can be hard to draw the line. Well, should I use 3 letters or should I use 4 letters? Well, May is 3 letters already, but March is 5. But if I just do M-A-R-C, then it looks weird. So the number format is just a lot cleaner and it's easier to be consistent with. As you're building your resume, another thing we want to be thinking about is our use of white space. So on the left side, Michael Williams, we can see he has some nice white space between each of his sections. Each experience that he has listed there stands apart from the other one because there's white space on either side. There's a little bit of white space on the right side of the page, but not a ton. He's really using a lot of the page. However, Betty on the right-hand side, there is a lot of white space on the left side of that document, and I see that white space as wasted space because on the right side of the document, all of the entries are kind of smushed together, and so we're not as easily able to identify each individual piece. I would encourage Betty Barnes to slide all that text over to the left on their page and then put the spacing in between the individual entries as opposed to just on the left side of the page. All right, that was a little bit about the format of your resume. Let's get into what content should be on your resume. There are 4 key sections. First is your header, second is education, third experience, and the fourth, which is optional but highly suggested, are other suggestions. Your header should always be at the top of your page. It should be the first thing listed. But then after that, it depends on your individual circumstances if you want your education to come first or your experience to come first or your other sections. So for example, if you're a full-time student and you're not working right now, you haven't had any real major jobs yet, you might want to put your education section first because that's what's most impressive. People are going to pay the most attention to what comes first on our document. So we want to lead with what's most impressive. However, if you've already had jobs that are pretty stable in the field that you want to be in, then you might consider listing your experience first. It really depends. There are a few pieces of required contact information that we absolutely need to include on our resume. Those are your full name, your email address, and your phone number. For your email address, we want to make sure you have a personal, professional email address. And when I say professional, I mean just your first and or last name and some numbers is usually a safe bet. However, we don't want to put the year that you were born in those numbers ideally because that will tell them how old we are. I encourage you to avoid using your CSUSB email address. because we're trying to establish you as having a professional identity outside of being a student. And when we use our student email address, it kind of reinforces this idea that we're a student. However, if you do need to use it, not the end of the world, just don't use the one with your student ID number. The one with your number sometimes has troubles when we email outside of the CSU system. And furthermore, it's harder to recognize that that email is yours when it has numbers instead of some version of your name. You might consider putting your city and state on your resume, especially if you're applying to work at places that are located near where you live. And you also might want to include your LinkedIn or your personal website. Back in the day, the advice for your resumes was to always put your full mailing address on your resume. However, things are changing a little bit, and I would encourage you not to put your street address on your resume. I can't think of a single good reason why they would need to have your exact street address until far later in the process when they've actually decided that they want to move forward with you. When it comes to your header, there are some format things to think about. For sure, we want your name to stand out on the page through bolding, larger font size, underline. Do what you got to do to make your name stand out. That's the most important thing about you. In addition, any links to web pages like your LinkedIn should be hyperlinked, like on the right side of the slide. Otherwise, we can use a shortened tiny URL or an abbreviation of our LinkedIn URL. We don't want them to have to be typing a bunch of random letters and numbers and characters to get to your website. It should be easy for them to find. We also don't want to include any other personal data like your birthday, your marital status, your photograph, your family name, or your family members. None of that stuff needs to be on your resume. In other countries, there are some different norms, but as long as you're applying to places in the United States, you don't need any of that. And then this header, whatever you put on the top of your resume, is the header that we're going to include on the top of your cover letter too, for a pop of extra professionalism. Here are some examples of headers. Some of them are pretty good. Some of them have some things that we would change based on what we just talked about. The only one that I think is absolutely not one that I would use personally is David Nelson's. We want that contact information to be right next to our name. It should not be difficult to find at all on the page. And here, it's kind of hard to see that it's on the right side of the page. It might get lost if someone didn't know where to look for it. So I would encourage you not to use David Nelson's, but some of these other ones have some good qualities. The next section that we are going to include is our education. And remember, it doesn't need to go physically next on your resume. It's just the one we're going to talk about next. Whenever you enter in a university that you attended, we want to have some required information about that education entry. And that is the full name of the school, not Cal State San Bernardino, California State University San Bernardino. We need the school location, unless the school name is said in the location like in CSUSB. Then it's optional. You can still list it, but it's already in the name, so you don't absolutely need it anymore. We want to format our date in this number format ideally, and you can list the date that you received your degree. You can put expected graduation or EDOT. You could list the range of dates that you attended. We want to also list the degree that you sought. So associate degree you could list, or you could be specific if it was of arts or science, or you could list BA or BS if you'd like. And then ideally we want to list both our major and our minor, but the major is the one that we absolutely need. After that, it's optional to list your minor, your awards and honors, and your GPA with a scale. If you're in the Jack Brown College of Business and you're in business administration, so not our information systems and technology, everyone is pursuing a Bachelor of Arts in Administration or a Bachelor of Arts in Business Administration if you want to specify. And then your major is in finance, in accounting, in whatever else you're studying. With your GPA, there's some things to think about, which I'll talk about on the next slide. We want to list our education in reverse chronological order, meaning whatever's happening most current is listed first, and then we go back in time. Because again, we're leading with what's most important, and what's most important is where you're at right now, as opposed to any other lower or less important degrees that you might have gotten. So CSUSB should be first, and then your other education can be after that. If you're at a university, you can skip listing your high school if you want. If your resume is short and you don't have a lot of other stuff, you can include your high school, but we definitely do not, no matter what, want to list the dates of our attendance in high school. Because if you tell me that you graduated from high school in 2020, I can guess within a range of 1 year exactly how old you are, and we do not want to tell them how old we are. When you're listing your GPAs, I encourage you to for sure list your GPA if it's 3.5 out of 4 or above. You are killing it. Excellent. Way to go. 3.0 or above, you're usually kind of safe, but again, if you're going into a super competitive field, having that 3.0 might not be as great for you as other folks that might have higher GPAs, so you could just list it off. If it's below 2.0, you're still getting your degree. You are still doing amazingly in my book. However, maybe we don't want to list it on our resume. If you studied abroad, you can definitely list your study abroad experience under the education section. However, we don't need to list as much information as before. We just need the university name, the location, and the dates. If it was part of a very specific program where you're taking classes outside of your major, you can list that too. But usually we just need the university name, location, and dates. And then if you have any awards or honors that you want to list, you can list them here if those awards aren't too numerous. We don't want to bog down that education section too much. Here are some examples of what your education entries might look like. Bachelor of Arts in Business Administration, finance emphasis. Dates are on the right. We've got Cal State San Bernardino listed. We don't need to say San Bernardino again if we don't want to because it's already in the title and we listed our GPA. You could abbreviate BA in administration, concentration in finance, California State University, San Bernardino, San Bernardino, California, and then minor and dean's list. You could put expected on the right, or you could be a lot shorter and just say AA Economics, Crafton Hills, UCaipa with your date ranges on the right. With our experience, there's some things to think about. What experiences do you have that make you a good fit for this position or organization? You might have had 5, 10 jobs already, which is totally fine, but not all of those are relevant or going to be important to list on your resume. So think about what sets you apart from other candidates, what's directly relevant to the job that you're applying to, and we're going to focus on those. Then we want to think about what headings make sense given the position that you're applying for. You can use generic headers like work history, work experience, work background, or employment history, employment experience, employment background, or professional history, professional experience, professional background. Any combination of those is fine. You can do the same with military if you have them, or internship. Otherwise, you could use project experience, volunteer experience, or community involvement if you don't have the formal workplace experience yet. However, you can also use specific headers that divide up your employment industry by either the industry that you were in or the position that you held. So you can have retail experience, tourism experience, finance experience, or you could have customer service and supervisorial or management as your headers for your different experiences section. Really depends on what you've got in your work history. Then in our experiences section, we want to be careful with our formatting. We want to list our sections in order of importance. So it's totally okay to only have one work experience section. That's totally fine. But if you have two, put your most impressive section first. Then within each section, we're going to list them in reverse chronological order again. So whatever has happened most recently is going to go first, and then you're going to work your way back in history within that section. And I know it's hard because you think you have to, but you do not need to list everything. So the job that you held for 2 months, don't need to include it. The job that you absolutely hated, that was not a job that you ever want to talk about again, don't list it. And then with each experience, we want to list our details with the exact same format. So we are going to include the job title or the project title. So what were you? What were you doing? Then your employer name or location. If it's a project for school, you'll want to put CSUSB. And we also need to put the city and the state. We also need the dates of our employment, and usually we use a range with the month and year. You don't have to use the exact day you started and ended if you don't want to. I would encourage you maybe even not to, because it just kind of adds more detail that's not super important. And then we're going to include 2 to 5 accomplishment statements as a bulleted list that describe what we did for work at that organization and what results we produced. More about those accomplishment statements. We can also think about them as action statements because we're going to be describing the actions we took. So we want to start our action statements with a past tense action verb that describes our role or responsibility. So we're not going to say had or did or took. We're going to use managed or coordinated or facilitated or tracked to have a more specific verb that illustrates what we did. Ideally, we want to illustrate the scope of the activities that we did. So, what was the size of our team, the size of our budget, the number of machines that we monitored, and what were the results of our activities? Think about that as the measurable gain. How many did you do, or what percent did you increase, or how many dollars were you in charge of? And then we'll also want to list any specific skills that we gained from the experience if possible. So when we're formatting it, again, we're going to start with a past tense action verb. Even for the jobs that you're currently holding, you can include past tense action verbs because you've already done it. Even though you're currently doing it now too, you've already done it in the past as well. We're going to tailor our statements to the position or organization of interest. Almost all of us have had a job where we scrub toilets at some point in time. That's just part of life. But if we're tailoring it to our current job that we're seeking for, unless we're going for a janitorial role, which would be great, we don't need to include it. We want to use indentation to signal points that are a subset. So if you want to talk about managing a group of people and then add more detail about how you manage that group, you can indent them and put additional bullets below. But ideally, we're always going to have 2 bullets for things. There's a rule of 2. If we have 1 bullet point, it just looks kind of lonely. So when we have 1, we should have another alongside it. We also want to quantify when possible and use specific examples. So we ideally want to emphasize our results produced, significant achievements, or anything that's important about what we accomplished, what we made happen as a result of our labor. And then the last section is the other options that we could include. You want to think about what shows your diverse, unique, and otherwise valuable experiences and points towards how you might add value to the organization. I know it's cheesy, but you're truly one of a kind. So how can you illustrate that on this resume? Here are some headings that you might consider on the right. You might include awards and honors section. You might include a languages section. Those of you that speak Spanish, put it on your resume, please. I'll talk about how to do that on the next slide. Or Chinese or any other language. It's very impressive when you speak a second language, even just a little bit, enough to help somebody in a pinch. Equipment you can operate, volunteer experience, clubs and organizations, skills, memberships, certifications, licenses, interests, but only if they're very, very relevant to the job that you are applying for. These are all different skills or sections you might consider including on your resume. I would highly recommend putting a skills section if I were you, as well as languages if you speak more than just English. If you choose to have a skills section, consider only listing proficiency level for tech-related programs and things like that. I've seen resumes where students in the past will say something like leadership and then give themselves an 8 out of 10. Don't give yourself an 8 out of 10 on leadership. Just list leadership. You don't need a benchmark for it. And then we might want to think about how you can order your skills in a logical way or bucket them by type. If I had to pick a number 1 pet peeve about looking at resumes, it's when there's a skills section and it just is a bunch of random stuff listed in this skills section and there's no logic or order to how it's presented there. It is just random. So on the bottom left side of the page, we can see how you can break up your skills by the type of genre they are, as opposed to just listing random things out on the page. So really I encourage you to think about how can you group your skills so that those are easy for your reader to find and understand. I mentioned including languages. When you include your languages, we also want to include your proficiency level for those languages. If you're equally fluent in both languages, you can list yourself as bilingual. Otherwise, we'll want to put the proficiency levels in there if we can. Many of you might have a recordable proficiency level, even if you don't think that you do. So look at intermediate low on this table on the left. Speak in complete sentences and have a simple conversation about common topics. Many of you who took another language in high school could consider yourself intermediate low in that language. So don't be afraid to list it if you feel like, yeah, I could have a basic conversation with somebody. And then your references. Back in the day, again, it was common practice to put your references on your resume, but now we don't do that anymore. We do not need to put our references right on our resume. That's using up very valuable space that we could use for something more important. And we don't need to put references available upon request because it's assumed that if they need references, you're going to provide them. However, I wanted to mention when you are choosing your references, choose managers, supervisors, instructors, ideally people that were at a slightly higher rank than you in the organization, and ideally those people who you actually work closely with who know you well. If they ask you for your references, what we're going to do is take that same header that's at the top of your resume and at the top of your cover letter and paste it onto another piece of paper and then put our references on that piece of paper. So we want to list at least 3 people, and before you list them, ask for their permission to list them, because that way they can anticipate, okay, I might be getting a call from this person, but it also gives you an opportunity to make sure they're going to be a good reference for you. So you can say, would you be willing to serve as a positive reference on my behalf? Or would you be willing to speak positively about me if I listed you as a reference when I'm on the job market? That way, if they're so-so about you, or you're not sure how they feel about you, then that gives them an out to be like, maybe not today. And we want to provide their preferred contact information. I used to call references when I worked at a manufacturing plant, and it was really frustrating to call a phone number that would be no longer in service, or to email an account that would get a bounce back email. When you're providing their contact information, we want their name and the organization where they worked at, ideally what their role was, and also what their relationship to you was. How often did you work with them? Did you have this professor for 2 classes or 1 class? And then their contact information. I'm doubling down on this. Do not include your references on your resume, please. That's wasted space that we could use for something else. And also don't write references available upon request. On the right side of the page, this is what that references sheet would look like. You've got that awesome header at the top of the page with references as the title, and then the folks are listed down the left-hand side. Here are some last other considerations. We don't want to lie, exaggerate, or include anything on our resume that we wouldn't want to talk about in an interview. If you're not so good at Excel, don't put Excel on there if you don't want to answer what function you would use to accomplish a certain task in Excel. We want to avoid using CSUSB specific and other jargon and acronyms without spelling them out first. People don't know what our acronyms mean, so spell it out and then put it in parentheses afterwards. We also want to avoid using the word I or any other first person pronouns on our resume. We don't need to say I managed this, we can just say managed this. We really want to have someone else look it over. Fortunately, we're doing that in this class, and we don't want to just rely on spell check. And then if you do decide you want to apply for positions in another country, find out what the resume expectations are in that country before you submit your resume there. So today I talked about some resume format considerations, the 4 key sections, which are your header, education, experiences, and then other sections, and then some of these other considerations at the end here. This resume, this document, is arguably the most important business document you'll ever create. So the time that you spend on it now, I think, will pay dividends in the end. Good luck.